Hi, it's Grandma here, and I'm reading Snow Treasure. Well, the previous chapters were kind of interesting. The children were able to sled right past the Nazi soldiers, and they found the place where they needed to bury their gold bricks and build their snowmen. Chapter 12. Peter would have liked to tell Uncle Victor about the events of that day, but Uncle Victor and his boat were nowhere to be seen. It was strange, for Peter knew that Clem Pearson was somewhere in the Snake. But look where he would, all he could see was black rushing water, the bobbing ice cakes, and the snow that covered ground and trees alike. It was getting late. They had to get to the homes before the blackout. It was 3 miles up the road from the beach. They'd have to hurry. It was twilight by the time the little band turned into the farmyard. Here they were on familiar ground. They'd passed the German sentries a second time. Again, they saw the friendly captain who had turned aside his soldiers. He was returning with his troops, and he greeted them. "Did you have a good sled ride?" he asked in excellent Norwegian. Peter was sorry he wasn't allowed to answer him. At the farm kitchen, Michael pounded on the door. "Who is it?" a frightened voice called out. When Michael gave their names, there was a scuffle inside. They had to be recognized before the door would be open. "But come in," the farm wife called, and Peter thought that for all the sadness of that terrible day, there was still a cheerfulness about the good brown face. That they had succeeded in carrying the gold past the Nazi sentries seemed to bring hope to Norway. "You had no trouble?" Her husband came out of a dim corner. Their supper was even now being dished into great earthenware bowls. Peter thought he had never smelled anything so good, nor had he seen anything for a long time as pleasant as the flickering, dancing light from the fire and from the candles on the dresser and great long kitchen table. First they eat, Papa, then they talk. Froholm and her servant bustled back and forth between the fire and the table. "Draw up now and eat. You are brave children. You must be famished." Great steaming dishes dotted the red and white checkered cloth. Meat, potatoes, dumplings, cabbage. On the table were so many cold foods: dried herring, pickled eggs, mackerel, and great round sheets of the hard rye knackebrod. Also, that's a bread. Also huge mounds of iced cookies. The children fell upon the food like puppies around a basin of milk. It disappeared like snow when brought into the house. Froholm and Marie, the servant, were kept busy walking back and forth between the table and the stove, refilling the bowls. Herr Holm sat in a rocking chair, his pipe between his teeth. "So you got through all right?" The rough old farmer could not wait to hear their story. "Papa, let them eat," his wife kept urging. "When Marie and I are washing up, you shall hear." Ja, eat your fill," he rocked contentedly. "It's wonderful that we have boys and girls like these who can trick the Germans and not get caught," he chuckled. "Shh, Papa, Spads everywhere," Froholm cautioned. "Could be even here." Peter drew a long sigh of satisfaction. Never before had he felt so content. The warm food sent a glow to every part of his body. "We fooled them all right," he boasted. "They even turned out of our way. The captain said they didn't want to spoil our sledding." With that, the 4 of them went into spasms of laughter. The tears rolled down Lovisa's face. Michael had to hold his stomach after all that food. "But what is so funny?" their host inquired. "Tell us so we can laugh too. You fooled them, but what is funny?" The 4 of them started talking at once, but they kept interrupting themselves to laugh. They started to tell of Peter's ride down the mountain, head on into the path of the German Army Corps. Then they all had to stop because they were choking. So it was some time before poor Herr Holm could make out what had happened. But when he learned the politeness of the captain, whose only fear was that he might spoil their sled track, he too shouted with laughter. They told him all that happened, even to Lovisa's finding the fallen trees. "But Uncle Victor's boat, it's not there." Peter was serious. You find the trees, but not the boat? Herr Holm chided. That's because your uncle wishes it so. You mean he sailed away? No, in the last war, things were hidden by what was called camouflage. What it's called today, I do not know. You cover well with branches of trees or with snow or whatever. Even from the air, you couldn't tell. Herr Holm would have kept the children talking all night if his wife had let him. To bed with them. Their eyes are buttoned with sleep. Peter remembered being led from the house to the barn, but was aware of nothing else. The next thing he knew, it was morning. Wake up, my little soldiers, the farmer was saying. Hours ago I came by and did my milking, and you heard not a sound. Peter was grumpy at being aroused. But would you sleep till noon? Herr Holm asked in surprise. You have work to do. Peter murmured, Why do we have to be in such a hurry? We can get past those sentries any time. Ja, if the snow holds. Herr Holm spoke anxiously. In the alarm, Peter jumped up. If the snow holds. Now remember, this is April, and they do have a lot of snow, but it's unseasonably snowy. I think it's probably the same temperature, but they have just a lot more snow than they normally do. But they can only do this when there is snow because they have the sleds. Chapter 13. All that week and all the next, there was a steady stream of children and sleds down the mountain. And every sled carried gold, sometimes as much as would equal 20,000 American dollars. Each morning saw a band of children trudging through the woods to the cave where the gold had been hidden a bare few days before the German invasion. By noon, the Norse children were well on their way to the Snake to bury their loads beneath the snow. Always the same thing happened. Partway down the mountain came the stop for lunch. From pockets came the flat packages Per Garson had provided, then the lookout and a sight of the invaders on the beach. But the view from the lookout was very different from the one Peter and his friends had seen the day the Germans had come to Norway. The freighter had steamed out to sea and had disappeared. Out of the turmoil of unloading had come a little city. Long barracks rose up at the foot of the fishing pier. There were other orderly buildings to house equipment and supplies. The children began to recognize some of the Germans. Peter often saw the blue-eyed private who looked that first day as if he too would like to be sled riding. Then there was the captain who had turned the troops out of the path of Peter's sled. But him they saw no longer. He seemed to have gone away. There was a new commandant, and the tales about him that reached Rijswijk were enough to make the blood run cold. There was now no doubt about passing the sentries. The children knew in advance they would not be stopped. Not even the fierce new commandant had thought to tell his pickets to challenge them. The Germans still tried to make friends with the children, but now, as before, they were met with silence. Cakes of chocolate were offered as bribes, but the venture ended its third week, and not a single Norwegian child had said as much as hello to any of the Nazi soldiers. The four friends had separated after the first day. Each had his own team, and they met only when they passed on the road, or two of them met at the cave or the Snake, or when the day ended at the Holmes farm. Peter's team and Helga's would go out the same day, and Michael's team and Lovisa's the following morning. For the first time in the history of Rijswijk, no one wanted to see spring come. Warm weather would bring the end of the snow and stop the sled trips. That far in north, the snow lasted well into May, sometimes late May, but the thaws could come any time now, and indeed were looked for since winter had set in so early. If the snow holds, was the one thought in all the town. Could it stay long enough to get the whole 13 tons of bullion to the Snake? Well, it was an unusual year, everyone seemed to say. Never before had the snow been so deep. Not even Granny Gola, who was 90, remembered anything like it. Will the snow hold? The townspeople asked each other. Will it hold? Pere Garson rubbed his whiskered chin thoughtfully. He looked at the sky and smelled the air and looked at the very snow itself. "Do you think it will last, Granny Gola?" he asked. "Yeah, I think it will," she answered brightly. It made him feel better, he told Peter. 3 weeks of hard sledding for the children, and what was the result? Back in the cave, Pere Garson looked ruefully at the big stacks of bricks that remained. Why, they seemed hardly to have made a hole in them. "How much more?" Peter kept asking him. Well, he was no Mr. Anders, the schoolmaster, but as well as he could count, it would take another 3 weeks, maybe longer, to empty the cave. They hadn't been able to do all that they expected. The smaller children couldn't pull the loads that Peter and Michael and the bigger boys could haul. The sleds had to be dragged on the level stretches of the woods and down on the beach. The girls had to take fewer bricks. Lovisa, who after all was only 10, had been too tired after that first day, and now she carried 2 bricks where she had taken 4. But Helga insisted she was strong as any boy, and not 1 brick would she give up. If all had gone as the grown-ups planned, most of the gold would have been taken down those first few weeks. They'd counted on moving 4 tons a week, but that was expecting each child to take 4 bricks or 75 pounds on each sled load. But there were less than a dozen who could do that. Instead of 4 tons, they were averaging only a little over 2 tons a week. "Well, it can't be helped," Pere Garson sighed. "But 3 whole weeks were gone, and the snow must melt sometime. If I only dared to do it myself," Peter heard him moan. That day the sun showed itself not once. There was not the faintest streak of brightness in the dishwater gray of the sky. The wind had died without a trace of breeze even off the sea. Without the sun, it ought to have been cold. Peter knew, but he had to open his lumber jacket as he pulled his sled home from the Holmes farm. Helga was cross and tired, and the two had quarreled about which of them had been the first at the Holmes pump. The quarrel was odd because Helga was ordinarily too busy to bother about such things, and Peter was known throughout the town for his even disposition. It was funny how as little a thing as the weather could disturb a whole day. He reflected as he lagged his way into the town. At home, Pere Garson complained of his bones aching. "I don't need any almanac to tell me when there will be a change in the weather," he said. "A change in the weather?" Peter's voice sounded high and exciting. "What sort of change?" But Pere Garson only shook his gray head and said nothing. After supper, Pere went out to bring in the kindling. He threw a big log on the fire. The curtains were drawn for the blackout. Their dark, heavy folds showed not the tiniest brightness, not even a glimpse of reflection from the fire. The northern day had lengthened. It should have been twilight, so the darkness outside was all the more forbidding. Miss Lundstrom was knitting in the light of a lamp, with a shade especially designed for the blackout. The lamp cast a gloomy look rather than brightness. Peter felt his mother's thoughts must be far away, for she had not even looked up when Pere Garson came in with the log. Pere raked up the ashes and soon had a fine fire. The wood burst into flame, and to Peter the whole room seemed livelier for its dancing light. But it blew a hot, gusty breath into the corner where Mrs. Lundstrom sat. "But, Pere, we don't need so big a fire," she rebuked him gently. "Why, it's hot enough in here to bake bread." "I'm sorry," the old man mumbled. "I guess I'm just plain absent-minded these days. My rheumatism bothers me and I forget." He shuffled out, the fire tongs still in his hands. Peter went to the kitchen to get a drink of water. Pere was busy locking the house for the night. When he'd finished, he came back to the window and, carefully shielding the light so it could not be seen outside, peered through the window. But there was nothing to be found out about this blackness. He stepped out of doors. Peter followed him. He sensed more trouble or sorrow in the old man, and he tried to find words of comfort. He thought Per was ashamed at having been so careless as to build a big fire. "Oh, don't mind about that," he said. "Mother doesn't really mind." "Hey? What's that?" Per seemed aware of Peter for the first time. "About the fire. Wood's plentiful." "What if you did build a big fire? It makes no difference, except it's too hot." "Oh, that!" Per seemed to shrug. It was so dark that neither of them could see the other. Per Garson shoved out his hand, and in doing so struck Peter smartly on the shoulder. Peter hardly knew what to make of that sudden blow, especially when no apology or explanation followed. Clearly, Per Garson had no intention of including the young master in what was going on in his busy mind. But next he spoke. Peter knew why he had been accidentally struck. Per Garson had only stretched forth his hand, and in doing so had hit Peter. But he found out what he wanted to know. He only spoke one word, but that word spelled catastrophe. What do you think that one word is? Okay, here are the clues. It's warm. It's very dark when it should not be. They are worried about the snow melting. Okay, rain, he said. So a rainstorm is on its way in. What's the rain going to do with the snow? It's going to melt it even that much faster. Plus, the kids will not be able to go sledding in the rain, I'm sure. Because rain, when the snow is melting, the sleds won't move nearly as fast, or maybe even at all. It'd be very hard to pull them through wet snow. Well, we'll see in the next chapter. Bye-bye.